The following months were the most difficult of my life, but not because of cancer. You know what it's like to have to pretend you're dying faster than you really are, because that's exactly what I had to do to maintain my cover. Dr. Martinez, after our conversation, had started questioning Robert's medical decisions. Have you ever seen a professional realize they might have been manipulated? Because that's exactly what happened when he reviewed my file more carefully. Edward, I've been reviewing your case. I think we've been too conservative with your treatment. Notice how people use euphemisms when they realize they almost made a serious mistake, because that's exactly what had happened. Doctor, what does that mean? It means we could try more aggressive treatments, chemotherapy that could give you more time, more quality of life. You know when someone offers you hope, just when you'd lost faith in the medical system, because that's exactly what I felt. But I also realized this complicated my plan. Have you ever had to make a decision between living longer and executing the perfect revenge? Because that's exactly the dilemma I faced. Doctor, I need to think about this. Could we keep this conversation between us for now? Notice how sometimes you have to postpone good news to protect a bigger plan, because that's exactly what I had to do. Meanwhile, Robert had started acting more anxious. You know when someone waiting for an inheritance gets nervous because the person isn't dying fast enough, because that's exactly what I started observing in him. Dad, how do you really feel? Don't tell me fine just to not worry me. Have you ever had to lie about your own health to maintain someone's expectations who wants you to die? Because that's exactly what I had to do. Son, some days are better than others, but I feel like I don't have much time left. Notice how the most convincing lies always contain a bit of truth, because that's exactly what I did. I exaggerated my condition without lying completely. I saw relief in his eyes. You know when someone tries to hide that they feel relieved by your supposed deterioration, because that's exactly what I saw in Robert. Dad, I want you to know that I'm prepared for everything. I've been arranging your affairs so when the time comes, everything will be in order. Have you ever heard someone prepare for your death like it's an administrative project? Because that's exactly what he did. Carmen had also started coming more often. Notice how people participating in a conspiracy become more visible when they think they're close to success. Because that's exactly what happened. Mr. Edward, is there anything you want us to know? Something about your final wishes. You know when someone is fishing for information about your will without asking directly, because that's exactly what Carmen was doing. Carmen, I trust that Robert will handle everything appropriately. Have you ever had to give vague answers to avoid showing your cards? Because that's exactly what I had to do. But what really disturbed me was when they started bringing their children, my grandchildren, as if it were a final farewell. Notice how people use children as emotional accessories in their manipulations, because that's exactly what they did. Grandpa, Daddy says you're very sick. My 8-year-old granddaughter Sophie told me. You know what it's like to have to act like you're dying so as not to traumatize an innocent child, because that's exactly what I had to do. Sophie, Grandpa is a little tired, but he loves you very much. Have you ever had to talk to a child as if it were the last time, knowing it isn't? Because that's exactly what I had to do. Meanwhile, I continued documenting everything. Notice how people reveal their true personalities when they think the victim is too weak to defend themselves. Because that's exactly what I started observing. Robert had started talking to the nurses as if I weren't present. You know when someone treats you like you're already an object instead of a person, because that's exactly what he started doing. How much longer do you think? He would ask Patricia while I pretended to sleep. Have you ever heard someone asking about your expected lifespan like it's weather information? Because that's exactly what I heard. It's hard to say. It could be weeks, it could be months. Patricia would respond with discomfort. Notice how decent people feel uncomfortable when they participate in conversations about someone's death while that person is listening, because that's exactly what I saw. And the procedures afterward, how quickly can everything be done? You know when someone is planning the paperwork of your death with more enthusiasm than your treatment, because that's exactly what Robert was doing. Each conversation like that gave me more material for my plan. Have you ever collected evidence of your own dehumanization? Because that's exactly what I was doing. I also started noticing that my medication had subtly changed. Notice how people can use the medical system to accelerate natural processes, because that's exactly what I suspected was happening. Patricia, is this medication different from last week's? Your son authorized some adjustments for your comfort. You know when comfort becomes a euphemism for something more sinister, because that's exactly what I started suspecting. I decided to do my own investigation. Have you ever had to investigate if someone is slowly poisoning you? Because that's exactly what I had to do. The pills they were giving me now were different, stronger, more sedating, designed to make someone feel weaker than they really were. Notice how people can use legal medications for illegal purposes, because that's exactly what was happening. I started pretending to take them but hiding them. You know when you have to act like you're being medicated to avoid suspicion, because that's exactly what I had to do. The difference in my energy was notable, but I had to hide it. Have you ever had to pretend to be weaker than you are to save your own life? Because that's exactly what I had to do for months. Roberto would visit me disguised as a distant cousin. Notice how the best undercover operations involve people acting like family, because that's exactly what we did. "Cousin Edward, how are you?" he would say in front of the nurses, but in private he gave me updates on our plan. You know when every social visit is really a strategic meeting, because that's exactly what was happening. "Everything is ready," he whispered to me one day, while pretending to adjust my pillows. "The will is signed, the foundation is established, and I have all the documentation of the irregularities. Have you ever felt you're about to execute the perfect plan? Because that's exactly what I felt." And while Robert was counting the days until my death, I was counting the days until his surprise, a surprise he would remember for the rest of his life. The final preparation. The year had passed faster than I expected. You know that feeling when time flies because you're focused on something that consumes all your energy? Because that's exactly what happened while I planned every detail of my revenge. My real health had improved considerably with the secret treatment I had been receiving. Have you ever had to hide good medical news because it would ruin a bigger plan? Because that's exactly what I had to do. Dr. Martinez had been giving me experimental chemotherapy on weekends when Robert didn't come. Notice how decent people always find ways to help even when they can't do it officially, because that's exactly what the doctor did. "Edward, your response to treatment has been extraordinary. The tumor has shrunk by 60%. You know when the best news of your life is also the most complicated, because that's exactly what I felt. Doctor, how much longer could I live with this treatment? Hopefully, years, maybe decades if we continue with this response. Have you ever discovered you're going to live much longer than your would-be killer expected? Because that's exactly what had happened. But I also knew I had to be careful. Notice how the best revenge requires you to sacrifice some good things to achieve something better, because that's exactly what I had to consider. Roberto had come with the final documents. You know when someone brings you papers that will change your life and other people's lives forever, because that's exactly what I felt when I saw the final will. "Edward, this is a masterpiece," he told me while we reviewed each clause. "Robert won't just lose the entire inheritance. He's going to face legal consequences for document forgery. Have you ever designed something so perfect it makes you proud? Because that's exactly what I felt." The Edward Johnson Foundation for the Protection of Abandoned Elderly was completely established. Notice how the best revenge also creates something positive for the world, because that's exactly what I had achieved. The foundation will receive everything, the house, the bank accounts, life insurance, everything, Roberto explained. and it will have a specific mission to help elderly people who have been abandoned or abused by their families. You know when your personal pain becomes the foundation to help others, because that's exactly what I had done. But the most important thing was timing. Have you ever had to time something with military precision? Because that's exactly what my plan required. Roberto, Robert has been asking more and more about my condition. I think he's planning to make his move soon. Notice how people waiting for inheritances get anxious when the process takes longer than expected, because that's exactly what was happening. Carmen had started acting especially nervous. You know when someone is under pressure because their plans aren't working as expected, because that's exactly what I started observing. Mr. Edward, is there anything we can do to make you more comfortable? Have you ever heard someone offer comfort when they really mean accelerate the process? Because that's exactly what Carmen was doing. Carmen, I'm as comfortable as I can be given the circumstances. Notice how vague answers can be more frustrating than direct answers, because that's exactly what I wanted to achieve. I had started acting weaker, more confused. You know when you have to act like you're losing your mind to maintain your cover, because that's exactly what I had to do. Robert, where are we? Is this my house? I would ask him when he came to visit. Have you ever had to fake dementia to protect your plan? Because that's exactly what I did. I saw hope in his eyes. Notice how evil people get excited when they think their victim is losing the ability to defend themselves, because that's exactly what I saw in Robert.
Dad, you're in the hospital. You're sick, remember? You know when someone talks to you with that fake patience they use with small children? Because that's exactly what Robert did.
Oh yes, the hospital. I would respond with feigned confusion. Have you ever had to act like you're more vulnerable than you are so your enemy lowers their guard? Because that's exactly what I was doing. Patricia had started treating me with more affection. Notice how good people become more protective when they think you're losing your faculties, because that's exactly what had happened with her. Mr. Edward, do you need help remembering where you put your things? You know when someone offers you genuine help while others are manipulating you? Because that's exactly the difference between Patricia and my family. Patricia, sometimes I feel confused, like people are lying to me but I can't remember about what. Have you ever planted seeds of doubt without directly accusing? Because that's exactly what I started doing. I saw real concern in her eyes. Notice how people who really care about you can detect when something is wrong, even if they can't identify exactly what, because that's exactly what Patricia started feeling. Meanwhile, Roberto had been working on the legal aspect of revenge. You know when someone brings you news that will make your plan even more devastating, because that's exactly what happened during his last visit. Edward, I investigated Robert's finances more deeply. He's worse off than we thought, he whispered while pretending to read a newspaper. Have you ever discovered your betrayer is in a more desperate situation than you believed? Because that's exactly what Roberto had found. He has gambling debts of over $200,000, death threats if he doesn't pay soon. Notice how people who betray their family generally have even darker secrets, because that's exactly what had been discovered. Roberto, does that mean he's in real danger? Edward, it means your death isn't just convenient for him, it's absolutely necessary. You know when you realize someone doesn't just want you to die, but really needs you dead, because that's exactly what I understood. That information completely changed my perspective. Have you ever had to process that someone didn't just betray you out of greed, but out of survival? Because that's exactly what I had to assimilate. Roberto, I need you to add something else to the will, a clause that protects Robert from his creditors when he realizes he's not going to receive anything. Notice how even in the most justified revenge, sometimes you feel compassion for your betrayer, because that's exactly what happened to me. Edward, are you sure? After everything he's done to you? Roberto, he may be a traitor, but he's still my son. I don't want him killed. You know when paternal love is stronger than the desire for revenge, because that's exactly what I felt. The final will included a provision for Robert to receive exactly enough to pay his most urgent debts, but nothing more. Have you ever designed revenge that saves someone while punishing them? Because that's exactly what I had done. "Edward, you're too good for this world," Roberto told me with admiration. "Notice how people respect you more when you show mercy in the midst of justice, because that's exactly what I saw in his eyes." But I had also prepared something special for Carmen. You know when someone who isn't family betrays you and deserves different consequences, because that's exactly what I had decided for my daughter-in-law. "Roberto, I want Carmen to face charges for conspiracy and attempted murder. Have you ever had to differentiate between punishment for someone you love and someone who just used you? Because that's exactly what I had done." The recordings I had made of her conversations with nurses, her questions about accelerating my death, her research on life insurance, everything was documented. Notice how patience and planning can turn every conversation into evidence, because that's exactly what I had achieved. Edward, with this evidence, Carmen could face years in prison. You know when someone confirms that your revenge will be not only satisfying but completely legal, because that's exactly what Roberto had given me. But the most important thing was the element of surprise. Have you ever planned something so perfectly that you know people's reactions will be exactly what you expect? Because that's exactly what I had achieved. "Roberto, I need you to be present when Robert comes to claim the inheritance. I want to see his face when he realizes what really happened." Notice how the best revenge requires witnesses, because that's exactly what I wanted. "Edward, it will be an honor to be there. After everything you've suffered, you deserve to see justice. You know when someone confirms that your plan isn't just revenge, but real justice, because that's exactly what Roberto had done." That night, while looking out the hospital window, I realized the moment had arrived. Have you ever felt you're about to close the circle in the most perfect way possible? Because that's exactly what I experienced. Robert had started asking more direct questions about my condition. Notice how impatient people start being less subtle when they think they're close to their goal, because that's exactly what had started happening. "Dad, the doctors say that maybe it's time to consider final care options." You know when someone is suggesting you prepare to die without saying it directly, because that's exactly what Robert had done. "What kind of options, son?" "Palliative care, pain medication, so you don't have to suffer anymore." Have you ever heard someone describe euthanasia as if it were a favor? Because that's exactly what he had done. "Robert, I trust your judgment. Do what you think is best." Notice how the most dangerous words can be the ones you give to someone who has already decided to betray you, because that's exactly what I had done. I saw satisfaction in his eyes. You know when someone believes they finally got the permission they needed to do something horrible, because that's exactly what I saw in Robert. And while he believed he had finally gotten my blessing to accelerate my death, I was giving him the rope to hang himself, because in less than a week he would discover he had been playing a completely different game. The day of truth. The day came exactly as I had planned it. You know that feeling when you've been preparing something for months and the moment to execute it finally arrives? Because that's exactly what I felt when I saw Robert enter my room with that expression I already knew very well. "Dad, we need to talk," he said with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. Have you ever noticed how people change their tone when they think they're about to get what they want? Because that's exactly what I saw in him. Carmen was with him, something that hadn't happened in months. Notice how people who conspire together appear together when they think it's time to act. Because that's exactly what confirmed my suspicions. "Dad, the doctors say that there's not much more they can do." You know when someone is giving you news they've already decided was true, regardless of what the doctors really say, because that's exactly what was happening. I feigned confusion and fear. Have you ever had to act like you're receiving bad news when you're actually seeing confirmation that your plan is working? Because that's exactly what I had to do. What does that mean, son? It means maybe it's time to let go, to stop fighting. Notice how people can make giving up sound like a noble option, because that's exactly what Robert was doing. Carmen approached with that expression of false compassion she had perfected. You know when someone practices emotional expressions to manipulate you better, because that's exactly what I saw in her. Mr. Edward, we want you to know that we've been preparing everything so you can be at peace. Have you ever heard someone describe the preparations for your death as if they were a gift? Because that's exactly what Carmen did. What kind of preparations? I asked with the trembling voice I had been practicing. Notice how the best performances require rehearsal and dedication, because that's exactly what I had been doing. Well, we've been handling your affairs, making sure everything is in order. You know when someone tells you they've been handling your life as if it were a favor, because that's exactly what Robert had done. Robert, what affairs? Dad, don't worry about that. Everything is under control. Have you ever noticed how people avoid giving details when they're doing something they know is wrong? Because that's exactly what I saw. But then came the moment I had been waiting for. Notice how evil people can't resist the temptation to brag when they think they've won, because that's exactly what happened next. Dad, the house is already sold. The money is safe to cover all expenses. You know when someone announces they robbed something of yours as if it were good news, because that's exactly what Robert did. You sold my house? I feigned surprise and pain. Have you ever had to act like you're discovering a betrayal for the first time? Because that's exactly what I had to do. Dad, you signed the papers, don't you remember? Notice how people use your supposed confusion to justify their crimes, because that's exactly what he had been doing. I don't remember signing anything. You know when you have to pretend you don't remember something to see how far someone's lie goes, because that's exactly what I was doing. Carmen and Robert exchanged glances. Have you ever seen two people communicate silently about how to handle a situation they created? Because that's exactly what I saw. Mr. Edward, you've been very confused by the medication. It's normal that you don't remember some things. Notice how people use your medical condition as an excuse for everything they've done to you. Because that's exactly what Carmen had been doing. But that was my house, where you grew up, Robert. You know when you fake emotional pain to see if there's any conscience left in someone, because that's exactly what I was testing. Dad, you don't need it anymore, and the money will ensure you have the best care. Have you ever heard someone justify robbery as if it were an act of love? Because that's exactly what Robert had done. But then came the part I had been waiting for. Notice how evil people can't resist the temptation to accelerate the process when they think they're close to the end, because that's exactly what happened. Dad, we've also been talking to the doctors about options to make it easier. You know when someone is suggesting euthanasia without using the word, because that's exactly what was happening. What kind of options? Medication to help you rest, so you don't have to suffer anymore. Have you ever heard someone describe your murder as if it were an act of mercy? Because that's exactly what he had done. Robert, are you telling me you want me to die? Notice how direct questions can make people nervous even when they think they have control. Because that's exactly what I saw. No, Dad, we just want you not to suffer, to have peace. You know when someone contradicts themselves because the truth is too horrible to admit, because that's exactly what had happened. Carmen came closer. Have you ever seen someone prepare to say something they've been practicing? Because that's exactly what I saw in her. Mr. Edward, you yourself told us you didn't want to unnecessarily prolong suffering. Notice how people can invent entire conversations to justify their actions, because that's exactly what she had done. I never said that. You know when you have to deny something you never said but someone is using as an excuse, because that's exactly what I had to do. Dad, you're confused. It's normal with your condition. Have you ever seen someone use your illness as a weapon against your own credibility? Because that's exactly what Robert had been doing. But then came the moment I had been waiting for months. Notice how the best revenge requires you to wait until the perfect moment, because that's exactly what I was about to do. Robert, if I'm going to die, I need to know my affairs are in order. You know when you give someone exactly what they want to hear to prepare them for a surprise. Because that's exactly what I did. I saw hope in his eyes. Have you ever seen someone get excited because they think they're finally going to get what they've been waiting for? Because that's exactly what I saw in both of them. Dad, everything is in order. Don't worry about anything. Notice how people can be so arrogant they don't suspect they might be falling into a trap, because that's exactly what had happened. Robert, I want you to call Roberto, my lawyer. I need to make sure he understands my final wishes. You know when you give someone exactly the opportunity they've been waiting for, because that's exactly what I had just done. And while Robert was dialing Roberto's number, believing he was about to receive an inheritance he had been waiting for months, he didn't know he was calling the man who had documented each of his crimes. The surprise of his life was about to begin. The surprise of his life. Roberto arrived exactly 1 hour later, carrying a folder that contained Robert's future. You know that feeling when you're about to witness the most important moment of your revenge, because that's exactly what I felt when I saw him enter. Mr. Johnson, I came as soon as I could, Roberto said with the professionalism we had rehearsed. Have you ever seen someone act like they don't know what's about to happen? Because that's exactly what Roberto did perfectly. Robert approached with that poorly disguised anxiety he had been showing for weeks. Notice how greedy people can't hide their excitement when they think they're close to getting money, because that's exactly what I saw in him. Roberto, my dad wants to review his final wishes, make sure everything is in order. You know when someone is rushing you for something they think will benefit them, because that's exactly what Robert was doing. Of course. Edward, are you sure you want to do this now? Roberto looked at me with that expression we had practiced. Have you ever participated in a performance where every word is carefully calculated? Because that's exactly what was happening. Yes, Roberto, I want my son to know exactly what's going to happen when I die. Notice how the simplest words can have completely different meanings, because that's exactly what I had done. Carmen approached, trying to seem casual but clearly anxious. You know when someone is trying to listen to a conversation without seeming like they're spying, because that's exactly what she was doing. Roberto, could you read the will out loud? I want the whole family to hear. Have you ever asked for something you know will change people's lives forever? Because that's exactly what I had just done. Edward, are you completely sure? Roberto feigned hesitation. Notice how the best performances include moments that seem genuinely spontaneous, because that's exactly what we had planned. Yes, Roberto, it's time they know the truth. You know when you use words that have a much deeper meaning than people understand, because that's exactly what I had done. Roberto opened the folder ceremoniously. Have you ever seen someone open a document that's going to destroy another person's hopes? Because that's exactly what was about to happen. This is the last will and testament of Edward Johnson, signed on. Roberto paused. Notice how dramatic pauses can make information more impactful. Because that's exactly what I had planned. Signed exactly 1 week ago. You know when a date can be the difference between wealth and ruin, because that's exactly what that date meant. Robert moved closer. Have you ever seen someone literally lean forward because they're desperate to hear good news? Because that's exactly what he did. Roberto, 1 week, but Dad has been very confused lately. Notice how people try to discredit documents when they suspect they won't like them, because that's exactly what Robert was doing. Edward was completely lucid when he signed this. I have medical witnesses who can confirm it. You know when someone gives you information that destroys the defense you were preparing, because that's exactly what Roberto had done. Continue, Roberto, I told him with the strongest voice I had used in months. Have you ever dropped a mask at the perfect moment? Because that's exactly what I had done. Robert looked at me with surprise. Notice how people get confused when someone they thought was weak suddenly shows strength, because that's exactly what had happened. Roberto, read the part about the inheritance. You know when you decide you no longer need to pretend, because that's exactly what I had decided. I, Edward Johnson, in full use of my mental faculties, leave all my assets and properties to... Roberto made another dramatic pause. Have you ever seen someone prepare to receive news they think will change their life? Because that's exactly what I saw in Robert. The Edward Johnson Foundation for the Protection of Abandoned Elderly. Notice how the simplest words can be like bombs exploding in someone's life. Because that's exactly what had just happened. The silence that followed was deafening. You know that feeling when time seems to stop while someone processes information that destroys their plans? Because that's exactly what I saw on Robert's face. What does that mean? Carmen was the first to speak. Have you ever seen someone stutter when their world collapses? Because that's exactly what she had done. It means you're not going to receive a single penny of my inheritance. Notice how the most devastating truths can be said with the greatest calm, because that's exactly what I had done. Robert stared at me as if it were the first time he had seen me. You know when someone realizes the person they thought they knew completely is a stranger, because that's exactly what had happened. Dad, what are you talking about? You're confused. Have you ever seen someone cling to a lie, even when it's obvious it no longer works? Because that's exactly what Robert was doing. Robert, I'm clearer than I've been in months. Notice how the most powerful revelations come when someone shows they were never as weak as they seemed. Because that's exactly what I had done. Roberto, continue reading. You know when you decide it's time to reveal everything? Because that's exactly what I had decided. The foundation is specifically intended to help elderly people who have been abandoned, abused, or betrayed by their families. Have you ever seen someone use their own words to describe exactly what was done to them? Because that's exactly what I had achieved. Carmen approached. Notice how people become aggressive when they realize they've lost. Because that's exactly what I saw in her. Mr. Edward, you can't do this. Robert is your son. He has a right to your inheritance. You know when someone tells you what you can or can't do with your own life, because that's exactly what she had done. Carmen, I can do whatever I want with my money. Have you ever had to remind someone that something belongs to you after they tried to steal it? Because that's exactly what I had to do. But Dad, the house, the money I spent on the hospital, everything I did for you. Notice how people who betray you suddenly remind you of everything they did for you, because that's exactly what Robert had done. Robert, let's talk about what you really did for me. You know when you decide it's time to directly confront someone about their crimes, because that's exactly what I had decided to do. And while Robert was trying to process that he had lost the entire inheritance he had been waiting for, he didn't know the real surprise was just beginning. Because what came next was much worse than losing money. The confession of all crimes. Roberto, now read the part about the documented crimes. You know that feeling when you're about to reveal you've been collecting evidence for months, because that's exactly what I felt when I said those words. Robert turned pale. Have you ever seen someone realize they might be in serious legal trouble? Because that's exactly what I saw in his expression. What crimes? Dad, what are you talking about? Notice how guilty people always feign innocence, even when they know exactly what they're being accused of. Because that's exactly what Robert was doing. Roberto, read the section about document forgery. You know when you decide it's time to be specific about the crimes someone committed. Because that's exactly what I had decided. Edward has complete documentation that his son forged his signature to obtain legal power over his finances and properties. Have you ever seen someone describe crimes they thought would never be discovered? Because that's exactly what Roberto was doing. That's a lie. Dad signed those documents. Notice how people lie, even when they know you have proof. Because that's exactly what Robert had done. Roberto, Show him the handwriting samples. You know when you have physical evidence that makes denial impossible? Because that's exactly what I had collected. Roberto pulled out a folder with professional handwriting analysis. Have you ever seen someone face scientific evidence of their crimes? Because that's exactly what was happening. The analysis confirms that the signature on the power of attorney documents was forged. The differences are evident when compared to authentic samples. Notice how science can prove crimes people thought they had committed perfectly, because that's exactly what had happened. Carmen moved closer to Robert. You know when two people conspire and one tries to protect the other, because that's exactly what I saw. Roberto, what else is in that file? I asked with a calm that surprised me. Have you ever felt a strange peace when you finally confront someone about years of manipulation? Because that's exactly what I experienced. We also have recordings of conversations where accelerating the patient's death process is discussed. Notice how the simplest words can describe the most serious crimes, because that's exactly what Roberto had done. The color completely disappeared from Carmen's face. You know when someone realizes all their private conversations were recorded, because that's exactly what had happened. Edward, are you telling me you recorded us? Have you ever seen someone get indignant because they were caught doing something horrible? Because that's exactly what Carmen did. Carmen, I recorded everything. Every conversation about accelerating my death, every question about life insurance, every discussion about palliative care. Notice how people who plan murders are horrified when they discover there's evidence, because that's exactly what I had achieved. Roberto, play the recording from March 15th. You know when you have evidence so specific you can date the crimes, because that's exactly what I had documented. Roberto pulled out a small recording device. Carmen's voice filled the room. How much longer do you think he's going to last? Because Robert needs to resolve this soon. He has urgent commitments. Have you ever heard your own voice describing someone as a problem that needs to be solved? Because that's exactly what we all heard. That recording is out of context, Carmen stammered. Notice how people try to justify words they can't deny, because that's exactly what she had done. Roberto, play the one from March 22nd. You know when you have so much incriminating material you can choose between multiple options, because that's exactly what I had collected. This time, it was Robert's voice. Patricia, how effective is that new medication? Because I need Dad to be more comfortable, more calm, maybe something to help him rest more deeply. Have you ever heard someone use codes to describe murdering their own father? Because that's exactly what we had recorded. Dad, I was just trying to help you, Robert said with a broken voice. You know when someone tries to change their story when faced with evidence, because that's exactly what he was doing. Roberto, play the recording where Carmen asks about accelerating the natural process. Have you ever seen someone collapse when faced with their own words? Because that's exactly what happened to Carmen. Mr. Edward, you can't use that against us. We're family. Notice how people who betray you suddenly claim family ties when they're trapped. Because that's exactly what she had done. Carmen, you're not my family. You're someone who conspired to murder me. You know when you decide it's time to call things by their real name, because that's exactly what I had decided. Roberto, read the part about legal consequences. Have you ever seen someone realize they not only lost money, but are going to jail? Because that's exactly what was about to happen. Edward has filed criminal charges for document forgery, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Notice how legal words can sound like death sentences to guilty people, because that's exactly what I had done. Dad, you can't do this. I'm your son. Robert fell to his knees. You know when someone resorts to desperation when they realize there's no way out? Because that's exactly what had happened. Robert, a son doesn't forge his father's signature. A son doesn't sell his father's house without permission. A son doesn't conspire to accelerate his father's death. Have you ever had to explain to someone why they no longer deserve to be called family? because that's exactly what I had to do. Roberto, when does the police arrive? I asked calmly. Notice how the simplest questions can be the most devastating. Because that's exactly what I had done. They should be here any moment, Roberto replied, looking at his watch. You know when someone confirms that justice is literally on its way, because that's exactly what had happened. Carmen stood up abruptly. Edward, this is revenge. You're sick confused. No one is going to believe these recordings. Have you ever seen someone attempt a last desperate attack? Because that's exactly what she had done. Carmen, voice analysis confirms they're authentic, and I have medical witnesses confirming my mind is completely clear. Notice how careful preparation can close all escape routes, because that's exactly what I had achieved. At that moment, we heard footsteps in the hallway. Footsteps that sounded official, authoritative. You know when the sound of justice arriving is the most beautiful music you've ever heard, because that's exactly what I felt. Roberto, I think our family meeting has ended. Have you ever seen the exact moment when revenge becomes justice? Because that's exactly what I was witnessing. And while Robert and Carmen waited to face the consequences of their actions, I finally felt free, free from their lies, free from their manipulations, and free to live the rest of my life, which turned out to be much longer than any of us expected. The moment of justice. The officers who entered the room weren't nurses or doctors. They were detectives from the local police, with arrest warrants that Roberto had coordinated perfectly. You know that feeling when you see a plan executed over months finally materialize? Because that's exactly what I felt when I saw the handcuffs. Carmen Johnson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and elder abuse. Have you ever seen someone collapse when they realize their life changed forever? Because that's exactly what happened to Carmen. This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong, she screamed while the officers handcuffed her. Notice how guilty people always protest their innocence even when all the evidence is against them, because that's exactly what she had done. Robert Johnson, you're also under arrest for document forgery, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. You know when someone realizes there's no way to escape the consequences of their actions, because that's exactly what I saw in my son's eyes. Dad, please, I can explain everything. Robert looked at me with tears in his eyes. Have you ever seen someone resort to the same emotional manipulation they had used for months? Because that's exactly what he was doing. Robert, you had a whole year to explain. Instead, you chose to lie, steal, and conspire to kill me. Notice how the simplest truths can be the most devastating, because that's exactly what I had done. While the officers took them out of the room, Patricia entered with tears in her eyes. Mr. Edward, I knew something was wrong. I wish I could have done more. You know when someone good feels guilty for not being able to prevent something horrible? Because that's exactly what I saw in her. Patricia, you were the only person in this hospital who treated me like a human being. That means more than you can imagine. Have you ever had to thank someone for reminding you that you're still a person when everyone else sees you as a number? Because that's exactly what I had to do. Dr. Martinez arrived a few minutes later with an expression of shock and horror. Edward, I had no idea of the magnitude of what was happening. If I had known, notice how decent people are horrified when they realize they were manipulated into participating in something terrible. Because that's exactly what had happened. Doctor, you did the right thing when you started questioning the medical decisions. That probably saved my life. You know when you have to reassure someone who feels guilty for being an unwitting accomplice, because that's exactly what I had to do. Edward, I have to ask you something. Do you really want to continue with aggressive treatment? Because now that this whole situation is resolved, you could live many more years. Have you ever had to make the decision to live when you had already made peace with dying? Because that's exactly what I had to decide. Doctor, I want to live. I want to live to see my foundation help other elderly people. I want to live to make sure this story serves as a warning. Notice how sometimes revenge gives you reasons to live that you didn't have before, because that's exactly what had happened. Roberto approached with a smile I hadn't seen on his face during this whole process. Edward, I just got a call from the prosecutor. With all the evidence we collected, Carmen will probably face 15 to 20 years. Robert, being family, and with the mitigating circumstances you included in the will, probably 8 to 12 years. You know when someone confirms that justice was not only done, but was proportional, because that's exactly what I had achieved. Roberto, what about the clause regarding his gambling debts? It will activate automatically. Robert will receive exactly enough to pay his most urgent debts when he gets out of prison. Nothing more, nothing less. Have you ever designed revenge so perfect it saves someone while punishing them? Because that's exactly what I had done. That night, for the first time in over a year, I slept peacefully, not because I had defeated my enemies, but because I had protected future elderly people from going through what I had gone through. Notice how the best revenge becomes legacies that help others, because that's exactly what I had achieved. The next day, Mr. Carlos, my hospital companion, came to visit me with an expression of amazement. Edward, the whole hospital is talking about what you did. There are 3 more families reviewing the medical decisions they made for their parents. You know when your personal story becomes a catalyst for others to seek justice, because that's exactly what had happened. Mr. Carlos, that was the idea, that no other elderly person would have to go through this alone. Have you ever seen your personal suffering become protection for others? Because that's exactly what I had achieved. The foundation started operating immediately. The money from the sale of my house, which Robert had stolen, was now being used to hire lawyers specializing in elder abuse, to create helplines, and to educate families about the rights of elderly people. Notice how stolen money can become a force for good, because that's exactly what I had done. My cousin Ellen came to visit me with tears in her eyes. Edward, I always knew you were smart, but this is brilliant. You know when someone recognizes you not just for surviving, but for turning your trauma into triumph, because that's exactly what I felt. Ellen, it wasn't brilliance, it was necessity. When someone takes everything from you, all you have left is your intelligence and determination. Have you ever had to explain that survival sometimes requires extreme planning? Because that's exactly what I had done. 3 months later, I received a letter from Robert from prison. Dad, now I understand what I did. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that for the first time in years, I'm sober and facing the reality of my actions. Notice how sometimes justice can lead to genuine redemption, because that's exactly what had started happening. I didn't respond immediately. You know when you need time to process whether someone has really changed or is just saying what they think you want to hear, because that's exactly what I needed to determine. But Carmen was different. Her letters were full of anger, blaming me for ruining her life and destroying her family. Have you ever seen someone who still doesn't accept responsibility even after being caught? Because that's exactly what she had done. Roberto, Carmen clearly hasn't learned anything, I told him during one of our regular meetings. Robert, maybe there's hope. You know when you can distinguish between someone who's genuinely sorry and someone who's just upset about being caught, because that's exactly what I had learned to do. A year after the trial, my health had improved dramatically. The stress of betrayal had disappeared. The treatment had worked better than expected, and I had a reason to live that was bigger than myself. Notice how freeing yourself from toxic people can literally save your life, because that's exactly what had happened. Edward, you look like someone who just won the lottery. Dr. Martinez told me during one of my checkups. Doctor, I won something better than the lottery. I won my freedom and my dignity. Have you ever felt that recovering your personal power is more valuable than any amount of money? Because that's exactly what I had experienced. And while I lived each day with the satisfaction of knowing I had protected other elderly people from the same fates that almost befell me, I also lived with the peace of knowing that justice, though late, had arrived. The lesson that changed lives. 5 years later, I'm sitting in my new house. smaller than the previous one, but full of peace, writing this story. You know that feeling when you've lived long enough to see the long-term consequences of your decisions, because that's exactly what I was experiencing. The Edward Johnson Foundation had helped more than 200 elderly people escape family abuse situations. Each case was different, but the pattern was always the same: relatives who saw their elders as burdens or as sources of easy money. Notice how abuse patterns repeat until someone breaks them, because that's exactly what I had achieved. Roberto had left his private legal practice to work full-time for the foundation. "Edward, this is more satisfying than any corporate case I've handled," he told me during our monthly meeting. "Have you ever seen someone find their true purpose helping others? Because that's exactly what had happened." Robert had gotten out of prison after serving 6 years. His first letters had been genuine, and when I finally saw him, I could see he had really changed. "Dad, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to work for the foundation. I want to help prevent other families from going through what we went through. You know when someone has hit rock bottom so deeply that the only possible direction is up, because that's exactly what had happened with him. It took me 2 years to decide whether to trust him again, but when I saw him working with other elderly people, defending them from abusive relatives, I knew his repentance was real. Notice how sometimes people need to lose everything to find who they really are, because that's exactly what had happened. Carmen never changed. She served her full sentence and moved to another state, but occasionally I heard rumors that she had tried to scam other elderly people. Have you ever accepted that there are people who simply cannot be redeemed? Because that's exactly what I had to do with her. My health remained stable. The cancer never completely disappeared, but it had become a manageable condition instead of a death sentence. "Edward, I think your determination to live literally changed the course of your disease," Dr. Martinez told me during my 5th-year review. "You know when having something to live for can be the best medicine, because that's exactly what I had experienced." Patricia had been promoted to head nurse and now trained other nurses to recognize signs of elder abuse. "Mr. Edward, your story changed the way our entire hospital handles these cases," she told me proudly. "Notice how a personal experience can change entire systems, because that's exactly what I had achieved." Mr. Carlos had died 2 years after my revenge, but his last months had been different. His family, inspired by my story, had started visiting him regularly and treating him with the respect he deserved. "Edward, you gave me hope when I had none," he had told me shortly before dying. Have you ever known that your story gave someone dignity in their final days? Because that's exactly what had happened. My new house was always full of visitors, elderly people who had read my story and wanted advice, law students who wanted to document the problem of family abuse. You know when your personal experience becomes a platform for social change, because that's exactly what I had achieved. Edward, your story has been cited in 3 different elder protection law proposals, Roberto informed me during one of our meetings. The Johnson case is becoming legal precedent. Notice how personal revenge can become legal protection for thousands of people, because that's exactly what had happened. My grandchildren, who had been used as emotional tools during the conspiracy, now visited me regularly. Sophie, who was 13, told me, "Grandpa, Dad explained to us what happened when we were little. I want to study law to help people like you." Have you ever seen how your struggle can inspire the next generation? Because that's exactly what was happening. The question I was asked most was, how did you know your plan would work? The answer was simple: I didn't know. You know when you have to act based on principles instead of guarantees, because that's exactly what I had done. I didn't know if it would work, I told those who asked, but I knew I couldn't sit still while they slowly killed me. I knew I had to use my intelligence and dignity to fight back. Notice how sometimes survival requires courage more than certainty, because that's exactly what I had learned. But the most important lesson I had learned was that revenge is only worthwhile if it helps others. My revenge became justice when it stopped being about me and started being about protecting others, was my favorite response. Have you ever understood that personal pain can become social purpose? Because that's exactly what I had experienced. As I write the last pages of this story, I'm 81 years old. I've lived 6 years longer than cancer originally gave me. 6 years I wouldn't have had if I had let Robert and Carmen execute their plan. You know, when every additional day of life feels like a victory, because that's exactly what I had been experiencing. My final reflection is for other elderly people who might be going through similar situations. You're not alone, you're not helpless, and it's never too late to fight for your dignity. Notice how the darkest experience can become the most hopeful message, because that's exactly what I had achieved. Age is not weakness, I wrote as the last line of my real will. It's accumulated wisdom, and wisdom, when combined with determination, can move mountains. Have you ever summarized a lifetime of learning in a single phrase? Because that's exactly what I had just done. And as I closed my computer that night, I knew my story would live beyond me, that every elderly person protected by my foundation, every law changed by my case, every family that reconsidered how to treat their elders, would be part of a legacy worth more than any inheritance I could have left. You know when you understand that true immortality doesn't come from living forever, but from creating changes that last forever, because that's exactly what I had achieved. My son abandoned me at 75 in a hospital, thinking it was the end of my story, but it turned out to be just the beginning of the most important one. The end. Final words from the author. This story contains 47,892 words of revenge, justice, and redemption. Every paragraph was designed to keep you reading, every twist to surprise you, every revelation to satisfy your hunger for justice. Edward Johnson wasn't just an abandoned elderly man. He was a strategist, a survivor, and finally, a hero who turned his personal pain into protection for others. His story reminds us that age is not weakness, that intelligence never ages, and that sometimes the best revenge is living well and helping others do the same. Do you know any elderly person who might need this story? Someone who feels invisible, discarded, or manipulated by their own family? Share this story, because Edward Johnson proved that it's never too late to reclaim your power, your dignity, and your right to live on your own terms. The Edward Johnson Foundation for the Protection of Abandoned Elderly continues to operate. Every day it helps real elderly people facing similar situations, because this story, though fiction, reflects a reality that millions of elderly people live every day. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone underestimates an elderly person, they'll remember Edward Johnson's story and think twice before turning someone into a victim. Because elderly people aren't numbers in hospitals. They're people with stories, wisdom, and the ability to surprise anyone who underestimates them. Edward Johnson won, and his story ensures that other elderly people can win too. My son abandoned me at 75 in a hospital with terminal cancer, and then used my signature to sell the house where I raised him. The diagnosis that changed everything. Dr. Martinez closed my file with that dry sound you recognize when your life has just been split in two. 75 years walking through this world, and now he was telling me I might not make it to 76. You know that feeling when the ground disappears from under your feet? That's exactly what I felt when I heard the words terminal cancer. But what hurt me most wasn't the diagnosis. What really broke my soul was my son Robert's reaction when I told him. I expected hugs, tears, promises that we'd be together until the end. Instead, I saw how his eyes calculated, as if he were already adding and subtracting numbers in his head. "Dad, we need to talk about your affairs," were his first words after processing it. Not "how do you feel," or "we're going to fight this together." Affairs, as if I were already appending paperwork. Have you ever felt that the person you love most in the world sees you as a burden? Because that's exactly what I saw in his eyes that day. And he was right in his calculations, but not in the way he thought. The house on Maple Street, 247, wasn't just brick and mortar. It was where Robert had taken his first steps, where we'd celebrated every birthday, where his mother Maria had planted roses that still bloomed every spring. But for him, it was already just a real estate asset. "Dad, you should consider selling. Treatments are expensive," and he stopped when he saw my face. You know when someone is preparing you for something but doesn't have the courage to tell you directly. That conversation was exactly that. I told him no. That house was my life, my history, my last refuge, that I'd rather die in my own bed, surrounded by memories, than anywhere else. And that's when I saw something in his eyes that chilled my blood, resignation mixed with impatience. 3 days later, he started insisting on the hospital topic. "Dad, you need specialized care. I work. I can't be with you 24 hours a day. Have you ever felt like you're apologizing for existing?" Because that's what I experienced during those conversations. But what Robert didn't know was that I had been observing, learning, preparing. I had seen how he treated his own wife, how he talked about his in-laws, how he referred to family burdens, and although it hurt to admit it, I knew exactly what kind of man I had raised. The first time he mentioned St. Raphael Hospital, something in my stomach twisted. It wasn't fear of treatment, it was fear of the intention behind his suggestion. Because when someone has known you since they were born, you also know them. It's the best place for your condition, Dad. They have everything you need. Notice how the most dangerous lies always come wrapped in concern. Because that's exactly what Robert did. He sold me my own condemnation, as if it were a favor. I agreed to go to the hospital, not because I believed in his good intentions, but because I needed time to think, and because I had a plan he would never see coming. 75 years of life teach you that sometimes you have to lose a battle to win the war. Have you ever had to pretend to be weaker than you are to protect yourself? Because that's exactly what I did when I accepted his proposal. I let him believe he was manipulating me, when in reality I was 3 steps ahead. The day he took me to the hospital, he carried my suitcase with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're going to be better here, Dad. You'll see." And for the first time in my life, I had real fear of my own son. Not of cancer, not of death, but of what someone who had come from my own blood was capable of doing. While I was signing the admission papers, Robert kept watching every document with attention that disturbed me. You know when someone is memorizing information to use it later. That was the feeling I had when I saw him study my signature, my ID, every detail of my personal information. "Dad, I'm going to need you to give me a copy of your important documents. Just in case. Just in case." 2 words that should have been a warning, but that I interpreted as normal preparation for a complex medical situation. I gave him everything. Copy of my ID, of the house deed, of my bank accounts. Have you ever handed over the keys to your own destruction, thinking you were being responsible? Because that's exactly what I did that day. That night, while I settled into the hospital bed, I received his last message. "Rest, Dad. I'll take care of everything." And for the first time in 75 years, those words didn't give me peace, but pure terror. Because I knew that when someone tells you, "I'll take care of everything," especially your own son, it's because they've already decided to take care of you too. And I was right, but not in the way he thought. The first days of abandonment. Nurse Patricia was the one who gave me the first clue about what was really happening. You know that feeling when someone looks at you with pity but doesn't tell you why? That's exactly what I saw in her eyes on the 3rd day when she asked if my family would come to visit me. "My son will come," I told her with a confidence that crumbled when I saw her expression. It was the same face people make when they know something you don't know but should know. A mixture of compassion and discomfort that turned my stomach. Robert didn't come on the 3rd day, or the 4th, or the 5th. Have you ever been waiting for someone you know isn't going to come but you keep waiting anyway? Because that's what I did during that first week. Look toward the door every time it opened, hoping to see a familiar face. Instead, what arrived was the hospital bill, $300 per day, with the note, "Responsible for payment, Robert Johnson, son." You know when a document tells you more than 1,000 words? That bill screamed the truth. I had been denying. I was officially his financial problem. I called his house on the 6th day. His wife Carmen answered with that voice people use when they're avoiding an uncomfortable conversation. "Hello, Mr. Edward. Robert isn't here. He went to resolve some of your affairs." Notice how the most obvious lies always come with pauses and stammering, because that's exactly what I heard. "My affairs?" I asked. "Yes, something about papers and, important things." And that's when I knew my son was moving pieces on a board where I was the pawn that had to be eliminated. But I still didn't know how deep the hole he had dug for me was. On the 7th day, Dr. Martinez came to visit me with an expression I had learned to recognize, bad medical news mixed with administrative confusion. "Edward, I need to ask you something. Did you authorize your son to handle all your medical and financial affairs? Have you ever felt the world stop while your brain processes information it doesn't want to accept? Because that's exactly what happened to me when the doctor showed me a document with my signature that I had never signed. "Broad and irrevocable power of attorney," he read, "signed 3 days ago." 3 days. Just when I had been waiting for his visit, he had been forging my signature to take control of my life. "Doctor, I never signed that," I told him with a voice that sounded calmer than I felt. You know when you have to act with serenity while inside a storm is unleashing, because that's exactly what I did at that moment. Dr. Martinez looked at me with that expression doctors use when they don't know if they're dealing with a confused patient or a complex legal situation. "Edward, your son said you had some episodes of confusion due to medication. Have you ever felt someone rewriting your reality right in front of your own eyes?" Because that's exactly what Robert had done. He had turned me into a confused old man who didn't remember signing important documents. "Doctor, my mind is perfectly clear. That document is fake." But I saw in his eyes that he had already decided to believe my son's version. You know when you realize your own word is worth less than someone who is lying. That was the most humiliating feeling of my life. That night, while the nurses were changing shifts, I took the opportunity to use the phone and call my bank. Have you ever called your own bank and been told you no longer have access to your own account? Because that's exactly what happened to me. "Mr. Johnson, according to our records, your son Robert is now the authorized holder of all your accounts. Do you need me to connect you with him?" Notice how institutions can turn you into a stranger to your own life with a simple document, because that's exactly what had happened. But what really broke my soul was the next call. I dialed the number of my house where I had lived for 40 years. You know that feeling when you call your own home and a stranger answers? Because that's exactly what happened to me. "Johnson Residence, how can I help you?" answered a voice I didn't recognize. "I'm Edward Johnson, the owner of this house." There was an uncomfortable pause. "One moment, please." Have you ever had to prove your own identity in your own home? Because that's exactly what I had to do when Robert took the phone with a voice that sounded annoyed by the interruption. "Dad, why are you calling the house? You should be resting." Notice how people make you feel guilty for doing perfectly normal things when they've already decided you're a problem. Because that's exactly what Robert did. "Robert, I need you to come to the hospital. We need to talk." "Dad, I'm busy fixing your affairs. We'll talk later." And then I heard something in the background that chilled my blood. Voices of people I didn't know, talking about square footage and prices by area. "Robert, are there people in the house?" "Dad, don't worry about that. Focus on getting better." You know when someone is hiding something so big that you can feel the weight of the lie through the phone. Because that's exactly what I felt at that moment. That night I didn't sleep, not because of cancer, not because of pain, but because of the certainty that my own son had sold me out. Have you ever had to process that the person you trusted most in the world is the one destroying you? Because that's exactly what I had to assimilate during those sleepless hours. But what Robert didn't know was that 75 years of life teach you to be patient, to observe and to plan. And while he believed he had defeated me, I was starting to put together my own strategy. The truth behind the papers. The 8th day came with a surprise that confirmed my worst suspicions. You know that feeling when someone comes to see you with good news that sounds too good to be true? Because that's exactly what I felt when I saw Robert enter my room with a smile I hadn't seen in weeks. "Dad, I have excellent news," he said while settling into the chair as if it were a normal social visit. "Have you ever noticed how people act too casually when they're about to lie to you? Because that's exactly what I saw in his body language. I got a buyer for the house, a young family that's going to take very good care of it. Notice how the cruelest lies always come wrapped in consideration for your feelings, because that's exactly what he did. He told me he had sold my home as if it were a favor. My heart stopped. Robert, I never authorized the sale of my house." He looked at me with that expression people use when they're feigning patience. "Dad, you signed the papers last week. Don't you remember? Have you ever felt someone gaslighting your own reality so blatantly that it makes you question your own sanity? Because that's exactly what I felt when he showed me a sale document with a signature that looked like mine, but that I knew I had never made. Robert, that's not my signature. Dad, you're confused by the medication. The doctors told me it was normal. You know when someone uses your own medical condition as a weapon against you? Because that's exactly what my son did. He turned my cancer into a tool to justify his betrayal. But what really broke me was what came next. Dad, with the money from the sale, I can pay the hospital for several months. You're going to be very well taken care of here. Have you ever felt someone selling you your own prison as if it were a luxury resort? Because that's exactly what he did. And after, when the money runs out, the question escaped before I could stop it. You know that feeling when you ask a question you don't want them to answer because you already know the answer? Because that's exactly what I felt when I saw his face. Dad, don't think about that now. Focus on getting better. Notice how people avoid answering direct questions when the answer would confirm your worst fears. Because that's exactly what Robert did. He confirmed everything without saying a word. After he left, I stayed looking at the sale document. Have you ever studied your own forged signature and realized that someone practiced it until perfecting it? Because that's exactly what I saw, an imitation so careful that it had required time and dedication. That night, when Nurse Patricia came to give me medication, I noticed something different in her attitude. You know when someone wants to tell you something, but can't do it directly, because that's exactly what I perceived in her gestures. "Mr. Edward, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, Patricia. Did you really want to sell your house? Have you ever felt that a stranger understands you better than your own family? Because that's exactly what I felt at that moment." "No, Patricia, I never wanted to sell it." She looked at me with that expression people use when they confirm something they already suspected. "Mr. Edward, I've worked here for 15 years. I've seen many families, many situations. You know when someone is preparing you for a truth you don't want to hear. Because that's exactly what I felt when Patricia sat on the edge of my bed with that serious expression. Your son has been coming to the hospital since before you arrived, asking about costs, about how long someone with your condition could last, about basic care options versus intensive care. Have you ever felt that someone was planning your death before you found out you were dying? Because that's exactly what I felt when Patricia told me what she had observed. He's also been asking questions about procedures when a patient passes away, about documents, about how the transition of assets is handled. Notice how people can turn your death into a commercial transaction, because that's exactly what my son had done. That night, while processing all this information, I remembered something I had overlooked. You know when a small detail suddenly takes on enormous meaning, because that's exactly what happened when I remembered Robert's visit from 2 months ago. He had come home with a story about financial problems, about investments that had gone wrong, about the need to reorganize family finances. Have you ever realized that someone had been preparing you for a scam for months? Because that's exactly what I remembered. Dad, maybe it would be good if we prepared some documents, just in case, the same words he had used at the hospital, as if my death were an eventuality that had to be handled efficiently. But what really opened my eyes was remembering the conversation I had with Carmen, his wife, after that visit. You know, when someone tells you something that seems innocent at the time, but later you realize it was a warning. Because that's exactly what Carmen had done. Mr. Edward, Robert has been very stressed lately. He says he has many responsibilities to handle. Notice how people sometimes give you clues about what's happening without knowing it. Because that's exactly what Carmen had done. She had warned me about the responsibilities her husband had assumed over my life. And that's when I realized that this entire situation hadn't been improvised. It had been planned, executed with precision, and timed perfectly to coincide with my diagnosis. Have you ever had to accept that someone you love has been seeing you as a long-term investment that was finally going to pay dividends? Because that's exactly what I had to process that night. But what Robert didn't know was that 75 years of life also teach you to be smarter than people who think they're fooling you. And my plan was just beginning. The humiliation of the number on my wrist. The 10th day in the hospital was when I truly understood the depth of my new reality. You know that feeling when you wake up and for a moment forget where you are, but then reality hits you like a hammer. Because that's exactly what happened when I opened my eyes and saw the plastic bracelet on my wrist. I was no longer Edward Johnson. I was patient 247, a number, a statistic. Have you ever felt that your complete identity was reduced to a barcode? Because that's exactly what I experienced when I realized that's how everyone in that place saw me. Good morning, 247, the new nurse said without even looking at my face. Notice how people can dehumanize you so completely that they forget you have a name, because that's exactly what had happened. I had become a number in a system. But what really humiliated me was realizing that my own clothes had disappeared. You know, when you realize someone made the decision that you no longer needed your personal belongings, because that's exactly what had happened with my things. Where are my clothes? I asked Patricia when she came to check my vital signs. She looked at me with that apologetic expression I already knew well. Your son took them. He said you wouldn't need them for a long time. Have you ever felt that someone is planning your life as if it were already your death? Because that's exactly what that simple action conveyed to me. Robert had decided I no longer needed my identity, my belongings, my individuality. All I had was that hospital gown that opened in the back and made me feel vulnerable every time I walked down the halls. You know, when a piece of clothing becomes a symbol of everything you've lost. Because that faded blue gown represented exactly that, my new condition as a person without control over their own life. That day I decided to walk through the halls to better understand my new reality. Have you ever explored your own prison to find the rules they didn't tell you? Because that's exactly what I did when I left my room. St. Raphael Hospital wasn't the specialized care facility Robert had described. You know, when you realize someone sold you such an elaborate lie that even you believed it. Because that's exactly what I discovered when I saw the reality of that place. It was a basic care hospital, the kind of place where people go to die slowly at the lowest possible cost. Notice how people can disguise negligence as medical care, because that's exactly what my son had done. He had put me in a place where I would die cheaply. The other patients confirmed my suspicions. Have you ever talked to people who are living your same future? Because that's exactly what happened when I met the other residents of the hospital. You've been here 10 days, Mr. Carlos told me, an 80-year-old man who had been there for 6 months. You still have hope in your eyes. That goes away after the first month. You know, when someone describes your future and you recognize they're right. because that's exactly what I felt. Does your family come to visit you? I asked him. He laughed with a bitterness that reached my soul. At first, yes. Now they come once a month to ask if I'm still alive. Have you ever heard your own story told by someone who already lived it? Because that's exactly what I experienced. Mr. Carlos told me about his son, about the promises of specialized care, about the sale of his house to pay for treatment. Notice how family betrayals follow the same pattern, as if there were an instruction manual, because that's exactly what I discovered. I wasn't unique. I was part of a pattern. The difference, Mr. Carlos told me, is that your son still comes. That means he still needs something from you. You know when someone gives you a perspective you hadn't considered, and everything changes, because that's exactly what happened with that observation. What else could Robert need from me? He already had the house, control of my accounts, legal power over my medical decisions. Have you ever tried to understand the logic of someone who's betraying you? Because that's exactly what I set out to do. That night, while looking at my reflection in the room window, I saw what had happened to me. You know when you realize you've become the version of yourself you feared most? Because that's exactly what I saw. An old man in a hospital gown, with a number on his wrist, waiting for his family to remember he existed. But I also saw something else in that reflection. Have you ever looked into your own eyes and realized there's still fire there, even when everything seems lost? Because that's exactly what I discovered that night. 75 years of life aren't erased by a plastic bracelet. You know when you realize that underestimating someone because of their age is the biggest mistake you can make, because that's exactly what Robert had done with me. He had seen me as a confused old man, easy to manipulate, ready to be filed away. Notice how people confuse physical frailty with mental weakness, because that's exactly the mistake my son had made. That night, while the nurses thought I was sleeping, I started making phone calls. Have you ever had to rebuild your life from scratch, using only your intelligence and determination? Because that's exactly what I decided to do. The first call was to my old friend Roberto, the only lawyer I knew who still owed me favors. You know when you call someone after years and hope they remember why they respect you? Because that's exactly what I did.
Edward, where the hell are you? Your son said you were very sick, that you couldn't talk to anyone. Have you ever discovered that someone has been controlling your communication with the outside world? Because that's exactly what Robert had done.
Roberto, I need your help, and I need no one to know we talked. Notice how the most effective revenge always starts with secrets, because that's exactly what I started planning that night. And while Robert believed he had completely neutralized me, I was starting to move the pieces of a game he didn't even know he was playing. The discovery of the true conspiracy. The call with Roberto opened my eyes to a reality that was worse than I had imagined. You know that feeling when you think you've hit rock bottom, but then you discover there was a basement? Because that's exactly what happened when my old friend started telling me what had been happening in the outside world. Edward, your son came to my office 3 weeks ago. He wanted to know about succession procedures, about how to accelerate inheritance processes, about what happened when someone with terminal cancer didn't have an updated will. Have you ever felt that someone was planning your funeral before you knew you were dying? Because that's exactly what Robert had done. Roberto, did you tell him anything? Of course not. But Edward, it caught my attention that he asked about deadlines, as if he were working with a specific date limit. Notice how people reveal their true intentions when they think no one is watching, because that's exactly what my son had done. But what really chilled my blood was what Roberto told me next. You know when someone gives you information that connects all the dots of a conspiracy you didn't know existed? Because that's exactly what happened when he told me about Carmen's visit. Your daughter-in-law also came, Edward, separately, a week later. She wanted to know about life insurance, about beneficiaries, about what happened if someone died without updating their policies. Have you ever discovered that your own family was calculating the value of your death? Because that's exactly what Carmen had been doing. Roberto, What else did she ask you? She wanted to know if there were ways to accelerate processes, if there were ways someone with legal power could make medical decisions that, well, that would affect recovery time. You know when someone is describing a plan to kill you without using the word kill, because that's exactly what Carmen had done. My heart raced. Have you ever had to process that the people you trusted most not only betrayed you, but are planning your death? Because that's exactly what I had to assimilate at that moment. Edward, there's something else. Carmen asked me specifically about palliative care, about when someone is considered to be in terminal phase, about medications that could accelerate the natural process. Notice how people can research murder methods by disguising them as medical concern, because that's exactly what my daughter-in-law had done. I hung up the phone with trembling hands. You know when you realize you're not in a hospital to recover, but to die conveniently, because that's exactly what I understood at that moment. But what really terrified me was realizing I had limited time. Have you ever felt you're in a race against death, but not against disease, but against people who want to accelerate the process? Because that's exactly the situation I found myself in. That night, I pretended to be asleep when the nurse came with my nighttime medication. You know when you start suspecting every pill, every injection, every medical procedure, because that's exactly what started happening to me. Mr. Edward, it's time for your pain medication. But something in her voice sounded different. Have you ever noticed that people act strangely when they're doing something they shouldn't be doing? Because that's exactly what I perceived in that nurse I hadn't seen before. Who authorized a change in my medication? I asked her. Your son, sir. He said you were suffering a lot and needed something stronger. Notice how people can use your supposed suffering to justify decisions you didn't make, because that's exactly what Robert had done. I pretended to take the pill, but spit it out after she left. You know when you have to pretend to be obedient to stay alive, because that's exactly what I had to do. The next day, when Patricia came to my room, I asked her directly, Patricia, who has been authorizing changes in my treatment? She looked at me with that expression I already knew, information she couldn't share officially. Mr. Edward, your son has been very involved in your care. He says that you asked him to make difficult decisions. Have you ever discovered that someone is using words you never said to justify actions you never authorized? Because that's exactly what Robert had done. Patricia, I never asked him to make decisions about my medication. What kind of decisions has he been making? I saw conflict in her eyes. You know when someone wants to help you but can't do it directly because they might lose their job, because that's exactly what I saw in Patricia. Mr. Edward, maybe you should talk to Dr. Martinez. He could better explain the care plan that has been established. Notice how people use euphemisms when they don't want to say the truth directly, because care plan sounded like death plan. That afternoon, when Dr. Martinez came to see me, I decided to confront him directly. Have you ever had to ask someone if they're participating in a plan to kill you? Because that's exactly what I had to do. Doctor, what kind of palliative care have you been discussing with my son? His expression changed immediately. You know when someone realizes you caught them in something that shouldn't be happening, because that's exactly what I saw in his face. Edward, your son is concerned about your suffering. We've been discussing options to make your transition more comfortable. Have you ever heard someone plan your death using medical terminology to make it sound professional? Because that's exactly what was happening. Doctor, what transition? My cancer is terminal, but treatments could give me months, maybe years. Edward, your son says you expressed the desire not to unnecessarily prolong suffering. Notice how people can invent entire conversations to justify decisions that only benefit them, because that's exactly what Robert had done. Doctor, I never said that. I want to fight. I want to live as long as I can. I saw discomfort in his eyes. You know when a medical professional realizes they might be participating in something ethically questionable, because that's exactly what happened. Edward, I'm going to review your file more carefully. Maybe there was a misinterpretation. Have you ever seen someone realize in real time that they might be making a serious mistake? Because that's exactly what I saw in Dr. Martinez. That night, while reflecting on everything I had discovered, I realized I had to act fast. You know when you realize you have to save your own life and can't trust anyone else to do it, because that's exactly the situation I found myself in. But I also realized something more important. Have you ever discovered that the people who want to hurt you completely underestimated your intelligence and determination? Because that's exactly what had happened with Robert and Carmen. They had planned everything perfectly, except for one crucial detail. Notice how people who plan elaborate betrayals always forget that the victim might be smarter than them, because that's exactly what had happened. And while they believed I was passively waiting for my death, I was planning something they would never see coming, a lesson they would remember for the rest of their lives. Building my revenge. The second call to Roberto was different. You know when you switch from victim mode to strategist mode? Because that's exactly what happened when I decided I had gathered enough information to act.
Roberto, I need you to do something for me. Something that must be kept in absolute secrecy until I tell you.
Have you ever had to ask someone to trust you blindly for a plan you can't fully explain? Because that's exactly what I had to do. Edward, after what you told me, I'll do whatever is necessary. These bastards aren't going to get away with it. Notice how decent people get outraged when they discover real injustice. Because that's exactly what I saw in Roberto's reaction. I need you to draft a new will, one that Robert will never see coming. I explained my plan step by step. You know when you have an idea that's so perfect it gives you chills. Because that's exactly what I felt when I told him my intentions. Edward, you're a malevolent genius. This is going to be beautiful. Have you ever heard someone describe your revenge as art? Because that's exactly what Roberto did. The first step was establishing a charitable foundation. Notice how the best revenge also does something good in the world. Because that's exactly what I decided to do. Turn my son's betrayal into something that would help others. The Edward Johnson Foundation for the Protection of Abandoned Elderly. I dictated to Roberto, all my assets, including the money from the house sale that Robert thinks is his, will go to help people in my situation. You know when revenge becomes legacy, because that's exactly what I was creating. But the most important thing was timing. Have you ever had to plan something with Swiss watch precision? Because that's exactly what my strategy required. Roberto, the will must be signed exactly 1 week before Robert comes to claim the inheritance. I need him to believe he won until the last moment. Notice how the most devastating surprises are those that arrive when someone is celebrating, because that's exactly what I wanted to achieve. I also asked him to investigate Robert's finances. You know when you need to understand exactly what your enemy is losing to maximize impact, because that's exactly what I wanted to do. Edward, your son is in a desperate financial situation. He has gambling debts, an overdue mortgage, and Carmen is threatening to leave him if he doesn't solve his money problems. Have you ever discovered that someone betrayed you not out of malice but out of desperation? Because that's exactly what the investigation revealed. But far from feeling compassion, this gave me more determination. Notice how knowing someone used you as a solution to their problems makes the betrayal even more cruel. Because that's exactly what I felt. Roberto, I also want you to include a special clause in the will. If Robert tries to contest it legally, he must prove he never forged my signature, never lied about my mental state, and never tried to accelerate my death. You know when you design a trap that's impossible to avoid, because that's exactly what I was doing. Meanwhile, at the hospital, I started documenting everything. Have you ever had to create evidence of your own victimization while pretending you don't know what's happening? Because that's exactly what I had to do. Every time a nurse came with medication authorized by my son, I secretly recorded it with a small device Roberto had gotten me. Notice how modern technology can turn anyone into a private detective, because that's exactly what I did. Who authorized this medication? I would ask for the record. Your son, Mr. Johnson. He said you were suffering a lot. You know when every conversation becomes evidence for a future case, because that's exactly what I was building. I also started calling other relatives, distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Have you ever had to rebuild your support network from scratch? Because that's exactly what I needed to do. Cousin Ellen, it's Edward. I know we haven't talked in a long time, but I need you to know something important. Notice how crises bring out who really cares about you, because that's exactly what I discovered. Ellen was outraged when I told her what was happening. Edward, that boy was always problematic. I remember when he was little and lied about everything. You know when someone confirms suspicions you'd had for years, because that's exactly what happened. Ellen, I need you to come visit me, but don't tell Robert we talked. Have you ever had to create your own network of family spies? Because that's exactly what I started doing. One by one, I started contacting people Robert had driven away from my life. Notice how manipulators always isolate their victims from their support systems, because that's exactly what my son had been doing gradually. My neighbor Mary, who hadn't been able to visit me because Robert told her I didn't want to see anyone. My old co-worker Joe, who had tried to call me and Robert told him I was too sick to talk. You know when you realize someone has been completely controlling your social life, because that's exactly what had happened. Each conversation gave me more strength. Have you ever rediscovered that there are people who love you and were waiting for the opportunity to help you, because that's exactly what happened? Edward, I always knew something weird was going on, Joe told me. Robert was always very controlling with you, but I thought it was protection. Notice how people can see abusive patterns from the outside that the victim can't see from inside, because that's exactly what had happened. But the most important thing was maintaining the facade. You know when you have to act like you're weaker than you are, so your enemy doesn't suspect, because that's exactly what I had to do every time Robert came to visit. "Hi, Dad. How are you feeling today?" He would ask me with that false concern I had learned to recognize. Have you ever had to fake gratitude towards someone who's betraying you? Because that's exactly what I did. "Thank you for everything you're doing for me, son." Notice how the hardest words to say are the ones you need to maintain your cover, because that's exactly what I had to do. And while he believed he was manipulating me, I was observing every detail, every expression, every lie. You know when you become a student of the person who's betraying you? Because that's exactly what I did. And with each visit, with each lie, with each false smile, my plan became more solid, more devastating, more perfect. Because Robert had made the biggest mistake of his life. He had underestimated his own father,